Travis Sanders, psychic, medium, and author, talks about growing up psychic, tips for your own psychic children, spiritualism, and the ethics of working with spirit. Welcome to the Spirit and Energy Podcast. Hello and welcome, everyone. This is Dan Johnson, and you're listening to episode 10 of the Spirit and Energy Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Performance Mastery Coaching and Consulting and Vibrational Intelligence Intuitive Readings. Please visit www.performancemastery.com and vibrationalintelligence.com. You can also subscribe to the Spirit and Energy Podcast on your favorite podcast app or visit spiritandenergypodcast.com. I'm very happy to welcome today's guest, Travis Sanders. I first met Travis several years ago in an advanced mediumship class. He is an accomplished clairvoyant medium, author, and teacher who has been working professionally for over a decade. His work with spirit has been featured on numerous radio and television programs, most notably A&E's Psychic Kids, Children of the Paranormal. That's right, Travis has been psychically aware since childhood. He says he is just a soul on a journey with a passion just like you. He is the author of 2 books, I Am Psychic, So Are You, and Practical Mediumship. Welcome, Travis.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you are one of the folks that I am aware of that was aware of psychic phenomena or spirit phenomena from an early age. Can you tell me what that was like growing up as a child when you had access to that kind of information?
So when I grew up, I was, I think I was always incredibly emotionally sensitive, intuitively sensitive, except I didn't realize it was anything that was different. For me, I actually felt like I was a little bit plagued almost, just because so much of my early years had so many things like panic attacks and things of that nature, which I later correlated to being intuitive or mediumistic, but I didn't have a reference point at that time, simply because I grew up in the Pentecostal faith. So things of a, psychic or spiritualist or occult arena were outside of my realm of what we were aware of or what we were brought up in. But I can always say I was very, very intuitive, very sensitive, and I never really felt like I fit in with a lot of other people. Even though I didn't feel that way, I think it was probably up until around puberty or so that I just assumed that everyone perceived things the way that I did. I assumed that everyone saw movies in their head, or everyone saw color around people, or everyone just had sort of this sense of a knowing. And as I got older and I started to become a little bit more outgoing, and I would speak these things that I would know, people would look at me like, well, how do you know that? Or, how did you come to that? And I just thought, well, maybe something different is going on here because other people don't seem to perceive things quite the way I do.
It sounds like there wasn't a time that you didn't experience spirit or you didn't experience psychic phenomena. It sounds like that's something that just was part of your natural everyday life from an early age.
Yeah, I would say that that's correct. I mean, I never really journeyed into mediumship in the sense of having a sort of a back and forth dialogue with spirit until I was older. And it wasn't really something that I even wanted, I think, until I was older. But even though communication wasn't there when I was younger, I was always aware of the presence of spirit.
And when you would tell friends when you were younger about what you would see or hear, and they'd go, "Ooh, how'd you know that?" Would they think, "Ooh, that's really cool"? Did they think you were strange? Were you the cool guy on the block? What kind of response did you get from your peers?
So it was probably up until high school. I kept very, very close circle of friends. And I remember, I think it was my freshman year of high school, that I guess the cat got out of the bag somehow, or word kind of spread about things that I had said or things that I had done. And it was sort of a mixed bag of reactions. Most people were really intrigued, very supportive. A few people were kind of scared of me. And at that point in time, I didn't mind that so much. But for the most part, I think people were always very supportive. In a way, there was I remember a brief period of that year where there was almost a I don't know if like a celebrity factor. Or I mean, it almost spread like wildfire to the point where even teachers were coming to me, having conversations with me or asking me questions or advice or for readings or things like that. And being a naturally introverted and shy person, I didn't like that. So I kind of backed off from that a little bit. But I think it taught me a really young age the importance of responsibility and how you do what you do and how you use the gifts and the talents that you have.
And I know ethics and groundedness are a couple of things that are important to you. And I'm going to ask you about those a little bit later. But one of the things I hear from listeners, like parents, will say, I think I might have a child who sees things or hear things that I don't, or they might be tuned in with their psychic ability. What can I do? What advice do you have for parents or family members when they notice that their child has connection to their intuition, a very strong connection?
I think the biggest thing that they can do is simply engage. I know a lot of times people will either brush it off because some of the experiences those kids have are coming from sort of a fear-based place, or they dismiss it, maybe because of religious background. And I think, and especially it depends on the age. I think at a very young age, it's important to just get as much from the child as you can without trying to encourage them or discourage them, just sort of letting it be what it is so they don't feel like they are doing something wrong or being something other than they are. I know one of the things that you were going to ask me about a little bit later had to do with the Psychic Kids TV show. In that particular experience, I saw, well, I'm sure several of those kids that went through that series had genuine perceptions. I saw a lot of parents who kind of pushed their kids because it was almost fashionable at that point in time, I think, to have a psychic kid. And that's one thing that I want to discourage parents from doing. When you're a kid, especially, usually psychic ability tends to sort of rear its head around puberty. There's enough going on between your changing body and liking boys or girls or whatever. Throwing spirits and visions and stuff like that into the mix can just really make a mess of things. But I think really just holding space for them and not putting a judgment or making them feel one way or the other about it is important.
So giving them space, being curious and open about it, but not pushing them or trying to make it something more than it is. Let the kid have their life, their everyday life.
Absolutely.
So when did you discover spiritualism and how did that impact you and your sense of connection?
Spiritualism is so hugely important to me. And I'd heard the word, but I think like a lot of people who aren't familiar with modern spiritualism as a movement or a philosophy or religion, up until I did that television show, I assumed that spiritualism was just being another word or a different way of saying that I'm spiritual. I'm a spiritualist. When I did that television series, one of the things that we focused on was some forensic stuff. And so they brought in a forensic medium, and about 3 years after we finished filming, I apprenticed with her, primarily in cold cases and missing persons. And she was from a family of spiritualists. Both her parents, her grandparents, and I believe her great-grandparents were active members of the Spiritualist church. And so she introduced me to spiritualism as a religion, as a movement, as a way of life. I, just as a person, have naturally always had a fascination with history and the Victorian era specifically. So when I started learning more about spiritualism around the age of 19, it resonated deeply within me. It was something that when I read those tenets of, as a spiritualist, this is what I believe, or as a spiritualist, this is what I stand for, it made much more sense to me than the Pentecostal religion that I was brought up in. It actually wasn't until the class that I believe that we met each other in that I decided to take a trip to Lilydale. From that point forward, I was 100% in.
I'm wondering if it almost felt like, oh, this is home for me. Like I found my tribe, I found my community.
It did feel like home. I remember, going to that particular summer, going to Lilydale for the first time. And it's one of the few places in the world where, I walk onto the grounds and I felt instantly, this is home. This is comfortable. I know this place. And it was a very similar feeling with Camp Chesterfield, going to Camp Chesterfield for the first time, just connecting with the people and the energy of the grounds. It was something that was so familiar. And one of the things that, especially being passionate about history, I'm passionate about some of the mediums of history and some of the teachings that have sort of been lost, especially since this New Age movement has become more prevalent. I think that one of my purposes for being here, at least what I feel as someone who is younger, being 30, when you go to a spiritualist church or a spiritualist camp, most of the people are older than that. I really feel sort of a sense of obligation or duty to make sure that these younger generations are being engaged and understand what spiritualism is.
You mentioned both Lilydale and Camp Chesterfield, and for those who aren't familiar with those places, those are small towns or villages where people living on the grounds there, interacting with spirit and using their intuition and psychic ability is a natural way of life. It's like woven into the everyday experience. It's nothing special. It's nothing not special. It's just taken for granted. It's almost like another way of living where we're a little unplugged from all this hype and media, and I'm really more plugged into spirit and my connection with spirit. So I agree with you that being on those grounds really feels like home, grounded, centeredness, and knowingness. And I really admire how those folks can make spirit woven into their everyday life and actions and conversations.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing.
When you talk about spiritualism, what significant events or people stand out to you from spiritualist history?
There are so many. When you talk about spiritualism, most people automatically, if they're familiar with spiritualism, jump to the Fox sisters. Being that I'm from Ohio, I've become incredibly interested in the history of spiritualism in my area. Much to my delight, I found that my area has been kind of a hotbed in the mid to late 1800s for spiritualism. One of the figures who I think does not get enough recognition in spiritualism is a man by the name of Tuttle. And he was from Berlin Heights, which is where I lived for a period of about a couple of years, Hudson Tuttle. And one of the things that he's famous for is he invented a device that sort of predates the talking board. It was called a psychograph. And it was a planchet-like device that had a free-moving dial in the middle. And around the planchet were different letters. So it was sort of a precursor to the spirit board. He was an incredible writing medium, and his wife, Emma Rood, was a trance medium who spoke trance philosophy. And so they actually started the very first spiritualist publishing company in the United States. Many of their books still exist to this day. The other one that I find incredibly fascinating is Jonathan Coons from Athens, Ohio. He was a physical phenomena medium. He was a simple farmer in the Athens, Columbus kind of area. He was the very first medium known to use the device of a spirit trumpet to aid in the physical phenomena production of independent or direct voice.
When you work with spirit, whether it's on a psychic level and you're getting psychic information, or when you're communicating with folks on the other side and your mediumship side, how do you get your information? Are you clairvoyant, clairaudient, clairsentient? How does that information come to you?
As a reader, I'm primarily clairvoyant and clairsentient. And those are the two things that I think made it a little difficult for me to sort of pinpoint that I was a psychic or that I was a medium, was because I've always been visual by nature and I've always been a very deep feeler. So if I'm communicating with spirit, or even if I'm getting information on that psychic level, it's kind of like ticker tape movies or symbols in my mind paired with feeling. And I think sometimes feeling and knowing, that line between the two sort of blur a little bit. I've noticed that my weakest channel actually has been clairaudience. I think part of the reason is that stems from an experience that I had that sort of scared me in my youth. So today in my mediumship, I always try to make an effort to get information in a clairaudient way, even if it's just one or two pieces or one or two names, because I really believe that oftentimes as mediums, we tend to identify our strengths and stick to our strengths. But I think that stylistic ruts are some of the things that can stop our growth and evolution as a medium. Identifying where we're sort of weak or maybe not as well-rounded, and then working on that particular muscle, I think can really benefit us in the long run.
And I think that's a sign of a good medium, to always either challenging themselves or adding to their toolkit, meaning that they don't get comfortable in a rut and do the same thing over and over. In media, it seems like clairvoyance, the ability to see spirit, is really raised on a pedestal. And a lot of folks who experience spirit but don't see it often discount their experiences because they're not seeing things in front of them. And so it's really important for listeners to know that there are many different ways of experiencing spirit. You can see spirit, clairvoyance, clairaudience. You can hear spirit, clairsentience, as you mentioned. You can actually feel spirit. You could feel their body or their emotions or even their thoughts. There's that claircognizance, that knowing. You just have a knowing about spirit that come to you. Occasionally I'll get that clairgustance where you can actually taste spirit, like their favorite food often gets popped into my mouth. So there are a lot of different ways. And I applaud you for stretching in your education, but also stretching the way you experience spirit, because I think a lot of us can get really comfortable with how we work with spirit.
Absolutely. One of the teachers that we've had in common is Sharon Klingler. And I think that's one of the many things that I've really taken from her teachings is finding new ways of stretching your perceptions or finding new ways of deepening your evidence just so you can stay fresh and stay well-rounded.
And trusting what you're getting is another strong message that she gets, which I think can be really powerful for anyone, whether they're new to experiencing spirit or they've done that for quite a while. That trust what you get.
Absolutely.
So working with psychic phenomena and spirit has some advantages and maybe some, I wouldn't say disadvantages, but it may have some drawbacks. So on the plus side, what has being tuned into your intuition, strong connection to the psychic ability and to the spirit realm, what's been the gift for you in having that ability?
I think there's a couple different ways that it's aided me in my everyday life. One thing that I always say is, as a human, I can be lonely, but I've never felt alone. And I know that a lot of people do. And because I've always felt the presence of the spirit world, even before they started communicating, I've never felt alone. And that in itself, I think, has been a comfort that some people don't yet know or don't know that they have the opportunity to experience. The other thing is, discernment is so important. And there have been so many times where things, opportunities, people have come across my path. And on the outside, it has pretty paper and it looks nice on the surface, but something inside just didn't feel right. And it was only after the fact that I was able to see, wow, I dodged a bullet there. And so I'm kind of in this place in my life right now of I don't even have to understand why I feel what I feel. If something's right, it's right. And if it's off, it's off. And if something's off, I trust it. And so I think that that's really given me a leg up, because I've probably missed some pretty painful or unnecessary experiences because I've had that to listen to.
So you've dodged some bullets by trusting your gut. And it sounds like, too, that you no longer have to apologize, or maybe you never did. Some of us have to feel like we have to apologize if everything looks good, but we decide not to go through with something.
Right.
What might be some drawbacks or maybe things people should be aware of as they grow in this ability?
Well, I think that almost in a funny sort of way, almost in the same sort of answer, you know what you know. And so I think sometimes we know things that we don't want to know. And, and I'm just using this as one of many potential examples, especially trying to date as a 30-something-year-old, where normally you would go through the paces and have your experiences with the person. It's like they can walk in and you'd be like, no, I can tell right now it's not going to work. You don't even have to sit down. We don't even have to have dinner. The other thing that I think is a common thread that can sometimes be a drawback with a lot of naturally sensitive people is even those who aren't necessarily psychic or mediumistic or intuitive, I think people can sense when you have a connection. And so sometimes you find people who, whether they're strangers or casual acquaintances, I think people tend to want to open up or vent to you or come to you for advice. And so it's been a big lesson for me, and I'm sure probably a lot of other people in psychic or mediumistic shoes, of really having to enforce healthy boundaries. So that line between friendship and reader, or friendship and client, or relationship and client, or whatever the situation may be, doesn't become fuzzy.
That boundary word is so important for folks who feel empathic and are highly sensitive. Really, really key. I'm glad you brought that up. And sometimes when you set your boundaries, people are accepting. And another challenge, on the other hand, can be when you set a boundary and people don't get it, or you need to create that boundary. Average person on the street who may not be as connected, they don't understand, and they might give a person a hard time or question their decision, when really creating that boundary and knowing what's right for you and trusting that has really got to come first, regardless of what other people think or say.
Absolutely.
As you have been on your journey in your psychic ability and your mediumship journey, what surprised you about spirit or psychic phenomena?
I think there are two things that have really surprised me. One is the simplicity. I think, and I know I am incredibly guilty of this, so oftentimes we tend to get into this idea where accessing spirit or accessing spirituality, we tend to think of it as being much more complicated than it needs to be. And like, I know when I was first starting out as a reader in my teenage years, thinking that I had to, meditate for half an hour before I did a reading or saw a client, or that I have to sit in the power for, half an hour every day in order to maintain a good connection. And we developed sort of silly rituals, and sometimes rituals can be helpful and sometimes they can be a hindrance. When I went through this period where I felt really disconnected, and I put all of that to the side, and then I just said, you know what, Spirit, if you're going to work through me, you'll work through me. If you don't want to, you don't want to, and that's okay. That the connection started to change. And so that was a really powerful lesson to me about the simplicity of spirit, because we are spirit. The other thing that really kind of blew the doors of my world open was when I experienced a physical phenomena seance for the first time, because it was something that I'd only read about or had experienced in historical accounts or research, and witnessing it firsthand was something that, even though logically I somewhat knew what to expect, just totally shifted my paradigm completely.
On the flip side of that, or maybe alongside with that, is spirit can be pretty humorous and sometimes kind of blue in their humor. Can you think of a time when spirit was either having fun with you or was being humorous as they were communicating with you?
I think in my sessions, I always try to bring a certain level of spirit's levity in, because there's always, as you said, spirit can be very sort of tongue-in-cheek sometimes, or, there's sort of a levity there because we're dealing with grief, which is a heavy emotion. It's a heavy vibration. If people are seeking a medium, it's usually not because they're in a happy place. I remember one time a young girl came to me for a reading. She was probably, just from looking at her, I would have expected her to only be maybe 13 or 14, but her father had passed. And so the mom brought her in because she thought it would be good for her to connect with her father. And so she sat down at the table, and her father, I could feel his energy start to move into my space. And there was just sort of this wise guy kind of energy to his being. And he started showing me orange traffic cones. And I said, your father, he keeps showing me these orange traffic cones and he's laughing about this. And she goes, oh my gosh, we literally just came here from the DMV. I took my driver's license test. And I said, well, your dad is telling me to tease you that you're a terrible driver. And it wasn't so much that I think that he thought she was a terrible driver, but I think that he knew that she was sort of in a not so great space. And so by kind of playfully teasing her, it brought a certain levity to the session that was, I think, healing and needed in that moment.
Very cool. What has working with spirit kind of taught you?
So one thing that I've really taken from my journey up to this point, both the high points and the low points, is that if you are doing the work of spirit, they will always provide you with what you need. It might not be what you want, it might not be what you're looking for, but they will provide you with what you need because you are being of service not only to them, but with them. And so I know even people listening who have maybe started doing this full time or are trying to make a living of this, it can be an incredibly scary thing. But I firmly have taken from my experiences up until this point, if you are willing to take the steps halfway, spirit will always meet you there. And that's something that when I'm feeling down or if I'm lacking, going through a period where I'm lacking confidence in my mediumship, I always come back to that. Has spirit ever not met you halfway? Has spirit ever let you down? No. So if I show up for spirit, spirit will always show up for me.
And that's a wonderful thing to trust in and build trust. And as you do build trust and see spirit coming through for you, that grows. But that can be a bit of a challenge for folks, especially when they're first starting on this journey or first awakening to the spiritual aspect of their nature. I know you have a book coming up soon called Practical Mediumship. Tell us about that book.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really proud of this one. So my first book was geared towards psychic development. I like to teach a lot. Teaching is my happy place, but I teach two big classes each year. One is a 2-day intuitive development course, and then the other one is a 2-day introduction to mediumship. And I just love watching people come in at various degrees of their personal development and just seeing them blossom and showing and proving to them what they're capable of. So this next book it's been about 3 years in the making. I've really been putting a lot into it. But when I was a teenager and I first started having experiences with the spirit world, I did not understand or could not make sense of what was going on. And so my first job was at a public library, which was so fitting because I've been a huge book person. I'm very bookish. I love to study. I love to research. And so at that point in time, they didn't call it metaphysics back then. They called it the occult section. For the 2 or 3 years that I worked at that library, I pretty much devoured that occult section. And I was always looking for a book in regards to psychic phenomena or mediumship that really gave me the answers that I was looking for. And I found that even today with contemporary or modern books on mediumship, that they give you so much, that they give you a certain amount up until a point, or I felt that I got a little bit of what I was looking for, but there was still some pieces missing that helped me connect the dots. So when Spirit started sort of narrating this book in my head, which is usually how it starts, my intention was to go into it with writing the book that I wish that I had when I first started out on my journey. As you said, it's called Practical Mediumship. It's 20 chapters. It's written very much in the way that I teach, which is a nuts and bolts style. I'm not super flowery in how I talk. I don't get into a lot of anecdotes. It's just very much the mechanics of this is how you get from A to B. As I said, that's how I teach. And so I really wanted to make sure that I covered all aspects of not only the spiritual side of it and the philosophical side of it, but the energetics and the mechanics and the practical aspects and the practical exercises so you can start engaging spirit and prove to yourself that spirit communication is your birthright.
Sounds like a good how-to book.
Absolutely.
On that topic, what are a couple things listeners can do to develop or strengthen their own either mediumship ability or psychic ability?
So in regards to the psychic aspect, I always tell people, you come to this class or you seek a book or you seek a teacher and author in order to develop a sixth sense. But most of the time, we don't even engage fully the 5 senses that we already have. We take them for granted. And so I think really doing some deep exploration of your senses, we perceive a very small fragment of the information that our brain actually takes in. And so it's just a mindfulness thing, whether I use the example of a tree sometimes. If I were to ask you to draw a picture of a tree, you would pick two crayons. You would probably pick brown and green. But in reality, if you ever actually look at the bark of a tree, you can find almost every single color within it. And so really just engaging your senses. Meditation is a big thing that I always harp on that makes people grown. In regards to mediumship, I personally found that there was a huge boom in my mediumship growth when I started sitting on a regular basis in a development circle. And so anyone who's seeking to develop either psychically or mediumistically, whether it be through a metaphysical shop, a spiritualist church, some sort of a spiritual center, if you can find a development circle, I think that is one of the better ways to go.
Very powerful. And I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier in the interview, and that is about groundedness and ethics. So could you share a few words about how people can stay grounded, especially if they feel that they're highly sensitive? And maybe ethics, we could talk about that for hours and hours, but maybe one or two considerations that you would invite listeners to consider as they grow in their either psychic ability and or mediumship ability.
Absolutely. So to address the groundedness aspect, when I was, I guess, sort of in more of a new agey bent, to me, when someone said get grounded, I thought I had to stop what I was doing, picture my feet becoming roots going down into the earth, and go through this whole process. And my very first teacher, who I actually encountered through that Psychic Kids show, the one who introduced me to spiritualism, she always used to say to me, like a broken record, get grounded. And I thought that every time she said that, I had to stop and go through that process. But what she meant, and what I've come to understand and teach other people, is that it's even more so than doing that. And if you need to do that in a pinch, that's wonderful. But even more than that process, it's about living groundedly. And that to me is recognizing that we are body, mind, and spirit. Because so often, when we start opening up to these, whether you want to call them higher dimensions or higher perceptions, I think some people are afraid of shutting down because they're afraid that they're going to lose that connection. But we can't ever truly lose that connection. And so engaging the body, we can't live in the clouds all the time. Go for a walk, do yoga, stretch, eat some healthy foods, take some time just to engage your humanness and your human experience. Just shut your brain off for the night and watch the Kardashians after a day full of readings or whatever you need to do is incredibly grounding. As far as ethics, one of the things that I see that drives me absolutely insane is when someone approaches someone who does not know them and they proceed to give a message. And it kind of goes back to that groundedness where you don't want to leave yourself open all the time. When it's time to work for spirit, it's time to work for spirit. And when it's time to engage life, it's time to engage life. And I think that some people feel like they're helping, but they can actually be doing more damage than good by approaching random people. A spirit contact, a spirit communication, to me is an agreement. It's something that's a sacred process. And so if someone doesn't ask you to get in their energy, or if they don't ask you to see what loved ones are around you, even if you have an inkling of that, it's not your business. And so I just kind of lean on the side of I keep my mouth shut.
Amen. I would double underscore that. That is one of my pet peeves as well. Along the groundedness theme, my sense is that you might be someone who enjoys some alone time. And maybe that's my own projection, because I know for me, I need my alone time. And I hear from listeners who are either sensitive, empath, working with their psychic ability, their mediumship ability, that's so much that they crave. How important is alone time for you?
For me personally, alone time is almost at the very top of the list. I'm a loner by nature. I'm not incredibly social. I'm not, I'm not the social butterfly type. You will never find me at a bar or a club or a concert. If I'm not working, I'm at home. I have my nose in a book, or I'm watching Netflix, or I'm reading or researching something. I have a very, I joke about it sometimes, but in a way, it's like I almost do have a low tolerance for social interaction. And I think it's because partly I'm a very heady person. And so I enjoy being in my head. I'm very cerebral. I tend to think a lot and plan a lot. And sometimes that can come across to people as socially awkward, except for when I'm working. I think there's a bit of a different personality that takes over when it's time for me to work or do any sort of public event. If I don't have alone time, I start to feel cagey, almost like when you see the tigers pacing back and forth in their enclosures at the zoo. Alone time for me allows me to decompress. And I think as mediums, we work a lot in very heavy energy. We work with other people's problems. We work in other people's life experiences. So if I'm not working, unless you're in a very tight, circle that I keep, you will probably find me alone.
And it's okay. It's perfectly normal to want that. I think in my coaching work, I hear a lot of folks feeling a lot of pressure. There's a lot of demands for their time, and a lot of people want to be with this person, or their family demands or friend demands. And it's really important, I think, for folks who need that alone time to recharge to really claim it and not have to apologize for it and not have to make it abnormal, because for half the population on the planet who prefer introversion, that's how we recharge.
Yeah, I've never understood when people act like, or when people say that they have a hard time being alone, because for me, that's when some of the most profound self-reflections or insights from spirit come in. And so for people who maybe are more introverted, I would encourage them to spend a little bit more time with themselves and in their own energy.
Travis, one of the things I appreciate about you is that your energy comes across vibrationally. People, either they're in your presence or listening to this, they can hear in your voice that you're someone who's very authentic and speaks from the heart and from a place of wanting to uplift the planet, uplift clients, do good things. Where can listeners find you?
My main website is psychictravissanders.com. I'm also, being that I'm a millennial, I'm a big social media person, so you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/psychictravissanders, and Instagram. I don't do Twitter. There's really no shortage of a way to get a hold of me.
Thanks. And physically, you are located where?
I'm out of Huron, Ohio. So I'm right on the lake, pretty much smack dab in the middle of Ohio at the very top, right on the lake. And then I also work out of a metaphysical shop called It's Your Journey. If someone can't reach me through whatever other means, reaching me through there, it's kind of like my second home.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Travis, for joining me today. I've appreciated the tips you've given us regarding mediumship, psychic ability. I really appreciate your thoughts on groundedness and ethics, as well as how we can best interact with our children who are exhibiting these abilities. So thanks again for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to connect with you again.